Welcome to the Customer Smarts podcast, where you'll discover smarter ways to deliver customer experiences. I'm your host, Justin Stafford, and in this episode, we've got a special guest, Shadin Mohammed, joining us. Shadin has worked for Google, held senior positions at Kentucky and Expedia, and she was most recently Chief Customer Officer at Silver Chef. In this episode, we're going to dig into why organisations are transitioning from a Chief Marketing Officer to a Chief Customer Officer. We discuss the difference between a CMO and a CCO, the challenges a CCO can solve, getting buy-in from executives, and how to embed a customer-centric culture. Welcome, Shadin. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
Hi, Justin. Thanks for having me.
Now, I'd like to start by getting your insights into the Chief Customer Officer role. As someone who's held that position, what are organisations struggling with that's really driven the need for this role?
Yeah, that's a great question. And we could actually spend a long time just talking about that, Justin, specifically because the title itself says it all. Organisations who are very customer-centric or, report to be very customer-centric might not actually have the framework or the structure in place to execute on the things that need to happen in order to make that statement actually true. So I think the need for a Chief Customer Officer is born from the fact that organizations are very busy working through strategies that may not necessarily either be in the best interest of the customer or are very important for the customer, but the execution piece is lacking and the alignment piece within the organization to rally around those strategies is lacking. So that's where the CCO role comes into play, not to be confused with the Chief Commercial Officer role. So they've both got the same abbreviations.
There's too many C-suites. You're seeing all sorts of chief of reception these days.
Yeah, that's right.
So what would you say the core focus areas for a Chief Customer Officer?
Yeah, so firstly, ensuring that every customer touch point is mapped and understood. It's extremely surprising, but on the other hand, not so surprising. When I go into an organization and I start a role, irrespective of whether that's a chief customer role or a marketing role or an operational role, how much information is missing from that piece and how much of it is missing between departments. So, one department might actually understand their touch points really well, but it might not be understood to another. And so you have these disparate systems and understandings of where the customer is actually interacting with the business. And look, it's not surprising because as companies grow and scale, that's the nature of the beast, especially when you're adding more channels and more platforms. With the emergence of digital, omni-channel and having every sort of channel that the customer is comfortable interacting with, and then trying to understand what that looks like at scale can be a challenge. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing, and I believe this to be, from my experience, the hardest step, it's to understand what the key issues are and agree on what those issues are. So I feel like this is the hardest step because it's not uncommon for people in an organization to disagree on whether something needs changing. So fresh set of eyes. I come into a business and I might, think about things that need to be changed, either because they're inefficient or they're not customer centric, before I've even thought of the solution, just to get consensus on the need for change for certain things or the need for optimization. That is the hardest piece because change is hard. It hurts. It needs an investment, not only in time, sometimes in resources and budget, but that time and that commitment from your leadership group and the commitment from those on the ground who, look, might have been doing things the same way for years and years and don't see any issue with it. So that focus area is the hardest for me because it's trying to change your mindset and culture. Once you get that, then you can go into solution mode, but there's no point in proposing solutions to problems that nobody agrees is a problem.
Yeah, very true. You got to start at the top, right?
That's it. Start at the top and, work with your stakeholders to get that consensus and talk to why you feel things need changing, if at all, or need optimization or introduction. Because, at the end of the day, if that part isn't done well, then any solution proposed, irrespective of whether it comes from the chief customer officer or people within the organization, has a high risk of failure. The new person, any new person coming into the organization, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, irrespective of their level, might be thinking of new and great ways to do things or a new way of approaching something. And, you hear this time and time again. They'll be warned, don't do that. We've tried it and it didn't work. And that's the first thing that I hear as an objection when I join an organization. And paradoxically, it's actually what helps me make the change. Because those who voice it are typically the ones that are either your change agents and your champions, they just don't know it yet, or they're the people on your target list who at some point need to be managed out. That sounds really harsh, but every leader has that list with those two columns of the supporters and those who are not really moving with the strategy, not really agreeing, don't want to make any change, not open to the, to new ways of thinking. So every leader has those two columns and names in each of those columns, and names might jump in and out from those columns, obviously over time. But I love hearing that when I walk into an organization, because it tells me very quickly what that landscape looks like and who's who. And definitely, something I can work with. And then the third focus area is to make sure that the chief customer officer is driving that alignment across the organization. So it really needs that focus on change management, driving the right culture, as we talked about earlier, and in some cases, rolling your sleeves up and helping to build new processes if necessary to get things moving. So those are the focus areas for a CCO.
Yep. A couple of big tasks in there. But yeah, we'll definitely dig into that, how you actually embed change in the next part. Got a few questions for you there because, that's something we talked about. That, as you say, I guess ideas are easy, but execution is always the hardest part. And, inside most organizations, you do have people who they're just being told, you can't do that, you can't do that. So, they sort of often talk to what you can't do first before actually opening up the mind and thinking about, there's actually some other ways you can tackle it, or let's really find out why it couldn't be done, and maybe there actually is a pathway through, which is kind of interesting. But I'd like to just firstly go back to, I guess, the chief customer officer and the chief marketing officer, and what's your perspective on the difference between the two? We're seeing some, big organisations like Coles and IAG have recently implemented a chief customer officer, and other organisations have been doing it for a long time. So it'd be interesting because a lot of people go, well, what's the difference between a chief customer officer and a chief marketing officer? What's your take on that?
It's really interesting as that role has emerged in recent times, and having done both roles now. There is a very nuanced difference because if you think about their roles, the CMO and the CCO, they're actually KPI'd to do very similar things, and there is a deep focus on the customer in the marketing team, but actually the CMO and the marketing team are not responsible for the operations within the business, and so what that tends to drive is a need to navigate the right structures and influence the right stakeholders to drive change, even when that will benefit the customer. So, as an example, you might come across in some organizations a lot of tension between marketing and operational teams because of that. So, marketing and tech or marketing and customer service typically led by different leaders, different executives. But a lot of what marketing needs to achieve with the customer lifecycle can't be done without collaboration and cooperation from those areas. So that's the biggest difference between the CMO and the CCO, who is responsible for driving that life cycle both strategically and operationally. So in my previous role as the Chief Customer Officer, my departments initially included marketing, customer success, so the servicing arm, and product. So I was actually interchangeably the CCO and CMO in that function. And it worked really well because it streamlined those areas strategically and operationally. As you said before, Justin, the strategy doesn't mean too much if you can't actually execute and get it done. But I have a bias for action, so anyway.
The next part is around that customer-centric transformation. So you see, I guess, a lot of organisations who, they've got the strategy, they've got the program plan, but then how do you actually execute it? How do you approach that? What's your process?
Yeah, also a really good question because, one of the things you ask when you walk into an organisation, whether as a consultant or as a leader, or even, if you've got a very customer-centric, if you're on the front line, customer-centric position, question might be, who owns the customer? And depending on the department you ask, it could be what the marketing team does, or those who look after the database, or, the customer service team, or the sales or the account managers. And so you get different answers. And then, when you're sitting at the leadership table, of course you hear, we all own the customer. I'm a little bit cynical about that because everyone is willing to say we all own the customer when it comes to developing the strategy. But when it comes to execution, nobody is accountable for some reason without, a specific team to execute or a specific agreement or alignment to execute against that plan. So, if everybody is responsible, then nobody is accountable, is how I like to think about it.
Yeah, that's good.
And without that champion driving that change, then it could result in all sorts of challenges. And the person or the people left suffering at the end of that are the customers and staff as well, because I think, we might talk about it a little bit later, but there's this deep connection between engagement of your people internally and how customers interact with your brand. I don't think you can separate the two. So yeah, when you have all sorts of challenges, both culturally, operationally within a business, at the end of the day, the customer suffers because of that. So in terms of how you would go about executing that, it would be to make sure that there are accountable owners. So whether that's the CCO and a team that is built, department within that area, or or alignment on the strategy and the plans, and clear accountabilities irrespective of the department of who is going to drive that change, that body of work, dedicated resources. It can't be a sometimes job or a KPI on top of a BAU. It just won't get done.
Yeah. And so what are the most important things you think to get right in that process, on that, that journey to being customer centric? What are the most critical things to get right?
So I'll give you some examples, but if I was to summarize to start with, you really have to prioritize what the customer's needs and preferences are. And that begins by understanding, valuing, meeting their needs through not just strategic bodies of work or initiatives, if we want to call it that, but through your day-to-day, through the BAU or business as usual practice. So I'll give you a couple of examples. Really making sure that the organisation understands who the customer is, first and foremost. Sounds very simple, sometimes not so easy to gauge when you have lots of segments, lots of products. So understand who your customer is through research and data, of course. Understand what those customers are saying, what their feedback is. And it's not just through NPS, right? It's not just through surveys. It could be through direct interactions. It could be through your day-to-day interactions with that customer over their journey. All of that needs to be gathered in the right way and easily accessed so that it can be reviewed and then decisions can be made accordingly, rather than, leadership team kind of guessing or thinking what is important when the customer actually hasn't had a say in their own, destiny, or their feedback isn't taken into account. The journey mapping, as I mentioned earlier, is very important so that you can not only map out where they're entering and touching your business, but also where the frictions are in those steps. Those are a couple of examples. You could go into training for your staff, making sure that your training, especially for frontline teams, prioritizes customer satisfaction. It sounds idyllic, because if you walk into any contact center, you still see, and I shudder, but you still see KPIs like talk time, especially in those big centers. Getting the customer off the phone as quickly as possible, for example, if it's a voice call, or pushing them into a self-service mode or online mode that they may not want to interact with, because the KPIs are set up in the wrong way. KPIs should not be get off the call with the customer because you've got 10 more to get through today. It should be around satisfaction and making sure that there's a one-touch resolution where possible. Do not palm that customer off to somebody else, because as you do each step along the way, the satisfaction drops each time. So those are a couple of examples.
Yep. Yeah, great examples. I think one of the other parts that's really I hear people struggling with is convincing the CEO and executive team on, I guess, developing a customer-centric approach. We chatted about it, I think, earlier or before, around your approach, to win over, or not win over, but to get the executive team on board with a customer-centric approach. Could you talk us through that?
Yes, and
Do you want me to give you clues? I think you sort of took a really interesting approach where you sort of, it wasn't about you. You kind of it wasn't about you being a hero. You sort of let other people come in. That was the...
Yeah, look, and the only reason I hesitate slightly with that is because it's a bit political. and I'll tell you why. Put it this way. I've never interacted with a CEO, and I've had for the last few years, direct reporting into a CEO. So I've never had any one of my bosses in the last decade, let's say to me, we shouldn't be customer centric. Never. Or that's a bad idea for the customer, or we shouldn't prioritize the customer's needs. But often when you're sitting at the executive table, it's not as simple as that. It's what does that actually mean? It means prioritizing initiatives, dedicating resources and budget, and putting your money where your mouth is when it comes to prioritizing customers and initiatives that support a customer-centric business. And so when you're talking about resources and dollars, there are so many things on the go, lots of executives around the table who all want a slice of that pie. And even though, as an exec team, we might all agree that this is the best way forward, there are lots of things that need to happen in some cases before we can get to that step. So foundational things need to be built. Other areas, risk and compliance might not be where it needs to be, so resources need to be put to that. And it's sometimes not an and conversation, it's an or conversation, or it's a let's do this first and we'll get to that. So to convince the group, it really is about making sure that they know what the impact is if we don't do something rather than if we do something. So everyone comes to the table prepared with their business case and how much value it's going to drive the organisation. And some of those figures are very methodical and mathematical, and other times it's just the most confident salesman in the room. Nobody actually goes back to revisit that original pitch to say, well, hang on a second, you've taken X% of our tech resources because you said you could deliver this. Nobody, in my experience, I haven't seen anyone come back to that really in a systemic way. So it would be making sure that the group knows, the CEO knows, the executive team knows what the impact is to the business if we don't do something. I found that's the way I approach it, especially when there's a lot of politics at the table and fight for resources. And then also, you mentioned at the start, as we talked a little bit about this before, there is a lot of politics in the C-suite. I'll just say it. Anyone hearing this who is a leader or, a couple of levels below and even in the C-suite will know it. It's not a surprise if I say it. So knowing how to leverage the politics to get things done, there are a lot of times where I will, and I've said this to you, I will throw credit to whoever wants to take the credit so long as it gets done. So I don't care if I wasn't the one who came up with the idea, if it wasn't me who executed, as long as it gets done and someone else takes the credit, I'm okay with that. That's very political, but I find that you get a lot done when you don't care about credit.
I really love that. I love that when you said that when we were chatting the other time, and I thought that really makes a lot of sense, because I think I'm similar in a way. I just want to get stuff done. Like, I don't care who, I'm not there to fly flags, say I did this. Like, I don't really care. And once I've done something, I'm on to the next. So I love how you frame that, because it's like, it's not about you. You just want to get it done. And if people want to take credit, then, go ahead, go and stick it on the fridge and tell your grandma, cool. But time to move on.
I mean, who cares? At the end of the day, it's important for your boss to know the value that you're bringing to the organization, obviously. But it doesn't have to be in such a direct way. And that's what being a change agent is about. Being a change agent doesn't mean taking the credit, flying the flag, being at the front of the line every single time. Finding clever ways to get things done and do what's right for the business and the organization. And you really need to understand people and their motivations to do that. So some of the best champions that I've worked with who help me get things done are those who have big egos, actually. Because, they'll take an idea and it's the best idea when they're the ones implementing and executing and when they get the credit. But if they're not the ones flying the flag, it's the worst idea in the world, isn't it? So knowing that... Just got to give it to them, make it feel like it's their idea. The best thing is when they position the idea back to you as if it's theirs, and you're sitting there smiling and nodding going, that's my idea, but now you think it's yours, so... Tick. You've opened a can of worms, Justin, because that is a completely different podcast, another topic about mansplaining and what it means to be spoken over, underestimated, or overlooked, especially when you're in from the diverse community. So I'm female, I'm culturally different, visibly so. We get a lot more of that than people who are not from diverse groups. But anyway, another podcast, another time.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And definitely interested in that, because I think, obviously little easier for me, trying to sell ideas. But yeah, I guess that's where people need to be more mindful. And I'm always the mindset, the best idea wins. It doesn't matter where it comes. Like if someone, like, we get along and we think in a very similar way, which is great. I love that. So yeah, it's really, really interesting that people still have those sort of biases, but just the work speaks for itself. I think, like you were hinting at before, if you're seen as the change agent and, actually getting stuff done, then people know who actually does the work and who's really driving stuff most of the time. Yeah. But, even when people are claiming it and they weren't really there, most people know, I think.
Absolutely.
So it'd be good to understand, what are some of the key KPIs or measures that a chief customer officer might look at that maybe a CMO wouldn't look at? So what might be new or different that they might be looking more into?
So as I touched on earlier, one of the key things that, an organization should be working towards, which is, championed by the CCO, is customer satisfaction. But when I hear people talk about KPIs surrounding customer satisfaction, the first thing they say is, it's a customer satisfaction score or a net promoter score, and then we're done. I think those measures are really important, but I don't think they're deep enough to really understand what is driving satisfaction necessarily. So you've got to add a few layers onto that. So what are the signals that tell you that a customer is satisfied or not? So, their lifetime value, or how much they're interacting with your business. That could come in the way of spending. That could also come in the way of referrals. So having a look at advocacy as an example. So how many, your referral rate of your customer group or a cohort. You're looking at things like your churn rate and your customer or your customer retention rate, and what that should look like for a particular cohort. You're looking at response time. So how long does it actually take you to respond to and resolve a customer query or issue or whatever it may be? Some people in contact centers measure that by way of a customer complaint resolution rate, as an example. So there are all these things. It's not just about measuring things that the customer tells you they're feeling, which comes through your customer satisfaction score, your net promoter score. So also measuring the things that the customer might not tell you, measuring the things that will impact satisfaction, such as, the servicing, how quick we get back to them, what their behaviors outside of your business. So how they referring, how they speaking about you, all of those things should be measures ultimately to determine what that satisfaction looks like for a customer.
Yeah, because sometimes I guess what customers might tell you in a survey might be different from their actions. So going off some of those behavioural based indicators is definitely where you should be looking, probably spending more of your time.
Yeah, absolutely. And I when I was working in the travel industry, this came up a lot where the product managers for the different products. And when I say products in travel, we're talking about destinations. So the product manager for international destinations versus the product manager for domestic would always be arguing about this, saying the next promotion, the next offer should be for my domestic product, because that is what customers are actually booking today. That's the most popular, that's the core business. And then the international product manager bring out a customer survey and say, well, look, 60% said they would go, on a trip to Antarctica or to, on a safari. That's where they want to go next. So really understanding the difference between aspirational feedback.
Yeah.
That's right. They might want to go to Antarctica. They might want to go on safari, but the reality is they're probably just going to go to the Gold Coast in the next 6 months.
Yeah, so, it's a lifetime goal versus the next 6 months type of travel. Yeah, it's interesting how numbers sometimes get painted in different shades. It can get manipulated in to prove people's points and get certain, I guess, programs of work across.
Although, I'd sign up to that Antarctica trip for sure. It's on my list, aspirational.
Yeah, why not? So I'd love to hear, I guess, a story about a CX project or impact that you've had that, you're really, really proud of.
There are many. And honestly, a lot of them are driven by the people and the team and their commitment to driving a change for the customer versus a big new shiny tool or piece of technology. That is the honest truth of it. A lot of the tools that we have now, there are plethora of, providers who can do all sorts of things to help you make your processes more efficient, get you the results that you need. But I look at those as tools, a means to an end, and it's the people behind that technology and your actual, the people in the chair who are doing the work, who are the ones that are make or break of that. So when I think of it that way, one of the things, and I'll talk about most recently, would be how the team was able, through some very basic, and I say basic / simple changes, a bit more complicated on the back end, but simple, and a simple idea, simple change, and slight change in behavior for our retention team that was able to stop a lot of the churn or delay a lot of the churn for customers who, sign up, their natural contract ends at 12 months. And through a conversation at the right time, I almost fell into the trap of saying, and no offense to anyone who says this, but I almost fell into the trap of saying the right message at the right time to the right customer. It's a bit of a stereotype, overused statement. But it really was about reaching out to the customer, let's say at the 10-month, 11-month point, having that conversation early about what their options were, followed by a series of very easy ways for them to tell us what they wanted. So there's a phone call, but there's also an email that had a very easy response that would then be actioned without them having to necessarily speak to us if they didn't want to. So just making it easy, and then an SMS, of course, making it easy for the customer to respond yes or no, and not forcing them to have that conversation over the phone with us if they didn't want to. So just those small tweaks in how we interacted with the customer, which I say small, but you needed to change the whole process, the KPIs of the team, the training had to change. Doing that saved us tens of millions of dollars. I won't go into the exact figures, but tens of millions. And it was within 3 months of that change. Yep. It didn't take us long at all.
It's crazy that it's such a seemingly simple thing can have such a big impact. And also one of the things is it's not like really sexy kind of piece of new innovation work, but the impact is huge. And I think a lot of that kind of stuff in every organization is getting overlooked. So it's really, really great story. Well, unfortunately, it's time to wrap up. Good news is that we might be seeing Shadden again, as she suggested that we do a reverse episode where she interviews me. So we'll look to do that maybe in about a year's time. But it's been so great to have you, Shadden. You provide some really great insight into being a chief customer officer. I think it's really fascinating. So thanks so much for taking the time to join us.
Thank you, Justin. Absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in. Some amazing insights from a great CX and marketing leader. If you found this insightful, make sure you hit the subscribe or follow button now, as we have some great episodes coming up. And if you have any questions or would like to chat, reach out to us at customersmarts.co. Catch you next time.